Welcome to NIPT's Decisions on the Go, using AI for over a decade to help you listen to New York State Court of Appeals decisions on the go. After the podcast, visit www.nipt.com/law to read the full decision.
People v. Andre Fernandez, decided June 23, 2026. Troutman. Defendant contends that his trial counsel was ineffective for failing to investigate his mental health and substance abuse history in connection with a challenge to the voluntariness of defendant's statements to police. We conclude that the lack of further investigation into these issues did not render counsel ineffective. Counsel's choice to proceed with an alternative strategy was reasonable under the circumstances, and counsel otherwise provided meaningful representation. 1. Defendant has a long history of mental health issues and substance abuse issues, leading to repeated hospitalizations and multiple diagnoses of mental illness. In 2004, defendant was charged for making a false police report in another state, but psychologists determined that he met the criteria for not guilty by reason of insanity. In February 2007, defendant contacted the Bronx Homicide Squad and told them he had information to provide regarding 2 unsolved homicides. At defendant's request, detectives picked defendant up. While at the Bronx Homicide Squad's office, defendant gave 2 written statements and 1 videotaped statement in which he confessed to his involvement in the homicides. Defendant was provided with Miranda warnings before those statements and responded that he understood his rights and wished to speak to police. Defendant testified before the grand jury against the advice of his assigned attorney that an assistant district attorney had promised him immunity in exchange for providing false information about his involvement in the homicides, and that he believed he would receive immunity when he provided his statements. Based almost entirely on the statements defendant provided, he was thereafter charged with 2 counts of murder in the second degree, among other crimes. Defendant's assigned counsel later moved to suppress defendant's statements. At a pretrial hearing, counsel argued that defendant provided those statements while operating under a reasonable belief that he would be given immunity in exchange for his information, and therefore the statements were involuntary. Counsel supported that argument with a variety of evidence, including, among other things, defendant's refusal to offer any statements until he could speak with an assistant district attorney, ADA, an unrecorded conversation with an ADA, and a note in the police file in defendant's handwriting stating that he would need immunity and payment in exchange for his information. Counsel also relied upon defendant's Miranda waiver form, on which he crossed out defendant and wrote in CI for confidential informant. Defendant also testified at the suppression hearing that he had been offered immunity by the ADA during the unrecorded conversation. The suppression court denied defendant's motion, finding that defendant's version of events was not credible and instead crediting the testimony of the people's witnesses that no offer of immunity had ever been made to defendant. At trial, counsel similarly argued to the jury that defendant's statements were involuntary because defendant was led to believe he would receive immunity, and defendant testified to that effect. The jury convicted defendant of 2 counts of murder in the second degree. Directly prior to sentencing, counsel became aware of the 2004 out-of-state case in which defendant was found to meet the criteria for not guilty by reason of insanity. At sentencing, counsel requested a CPL Article 730 competency examination at defendant's behest. Counsel also moved to be relieved and for new counsel to be assigned to explore the issue of whether counsel was incompetent for not bringing this issue to court prior to the trial. That motion was denied, and the court sentenced defendant to 2 consecutive terms of 25 years to life in prison. In 2019, while his direct appeal was still pending, defendant moved to vacate the judgment pursuant to CPL 440.10. He argued that his trial counsel was ineffective for failing to investigate his history of mental health disorders and substance abuse. The court ordered a hearing, at which defendant's trial counsel testified. Counsel asserted that although he was aware of defendant's mental health and substance abuse history, defendant had given counsel such a clear picture of what happened that was supported by documentary evidence, and that in counsel's 50 years of practicing, he had never had a case where he had seen or known of a case where he had seen that a person who shared defendant's mental health diagnosis successfully suppress a statement on that ground. The hearing court denied defendant's CPL 440.10 motion. The court observed that counsel pursued a coherent and legitimate defense strategy based on his conversations with defendant and the evidence at hand, and that based on that strategy, it was reasonable for counsel to choose not to further investigate defendant's mental health and substance abuse history. On appeal, the Appellate Division considered the 2010 judgment and the CPL 440.10 order together and affirmed both. The court reasoned that, although defendant used drugs and had psychiatric problems, those issues were not likely to undermine a finding of voluntariness here, where the videotaped statement itself provided the most direct evidence of defendant's voluntary waiver of his Miranda rights. A judge of this court granted defendant leave to appeal. We now affirm. 2. In determining whether a defendant has been deprived of effective assistance, a court must examine whether the evidence, the law, and the circumstances of a particular case, viewed in totality and as of the time of the representation, reveal that the attorney provided meaningful representation. People v. Oliveras, quoting People v. Baldi. In applying this standard, counsel's efforts should not be second-guessed with the clarity of hindsight to determine how the defense might have been more effective. People v. Benevento. Accordingly, a reviewing court must avoid confusing true ineffectiveness with mere losing tactics and according undue significance to retrospective analysis. Quoting Baldi. Rather, it is incumbent on defendant to demonstrate the absence of strategic or other legitimate explanations for counsel's alleged shortcomings. As long as the defense reflects a reasonable and legitimate strategy under the circumstances and evidence presented, even if unsuccessful, it will not fall to the level of ineffective assistance. Here, counsel pursued a reasonable and legitimate strategy under the circumstances and the evidence, and counsel's lack of further investigation into defendant's mental health and substance abuse history, in light of the evidence he had available, did not deprive defendant of meaningful representation. Defendant's contrary position, accepted by our dissenting colleague, amounts to second-guessing, with the clarity of hindsight, how the defense might have been more effective, without proving that counsel was ineffective in the first place. Benevento repeatedly makes arguments regarding what defense counsel could have done with more information, but our standard does not require us to evaluate what defense counsel could have done so long as what defense counsel has done is reasonable under the circumstances. In People v. Oliveras, this court held that counsel was ineffective for failing to conduct an appropriate investigation of records critical to the defense. There, however, unlike here, trial counsel sought to build a defense based on defendant's mental weakness, undermining the voluntariness of his admissions of guilt. Oliveras' counsel announced his intention to present the defendant's psychiatric records as a part of this defense, and had the court issue judicial subpoenas for those records, but then failed to execute those subpoenas or review these or other documents related to defendant's mental illness or condition. Accordingly, we held it simply cannot be said that a total failure to investigate the facts of a case or review pertinent records constitutes a trial strategy resulting in meaningful representation. In other words, in Oliveras, the strategy that defense counsel sought to pursue could not be fully developed without investigation into the defendant's psychiatric records. Here, by contrast, counsel's chosen defense did not necessarily require review of defendant's mental health or substance abuse records. Counsel's strategy was not born in the blind, as in Oliveras, because contrary to the dissent's conclusion, counsel could make a reasonable choice as to strategy without conducting further investigation into defendant's mental health and substance abuse history. Counsel knew that defendant had been diagnosed with mental health disorders and had an active addiction at the time of his statements to police. But based on counsel's review of the evidence, including, among other things, defendant's contacting of Bronx Homicide Squad on his own volition, his refusal to speak with officers until he could discuss immunity with the ADA, and his written statements and Miranda forms indicating his belief that he was acting as a confidential informant in exchange for immunity and payment, counsel pursued an alternative legitimate strategy that defendant was operating under a reasonable belief that he would be provided immunity in exchange for his information. The dissent's observation that police officers and prosecutors denied that defendant had been promised immunity does not render counsel's chosen strategy unreasonable, especially because defendant's conversation with the ADA, during which the ADA allegedly offered defendant immunity, was not recorded or memorialized in any writing. Furthermore, when the prosecutor who subsequently interviewed defendant on video stated that law enforcement was not making any promises to defendant responded, "Nothing in writing," which counsel repeatedly highlighted to support his chosen strategy. In sum, there is no constitutional requirement that counsel fully exhaust every avenue of investigation for every conceivable defense. We signal no retreat from Oliveras, nor its principles, that appropriate investigation of records critical to a chosen defense is necessary, and under certain circumstances, counsel's investigation of a defendant's mental health history is required. We conclude only that under the circumstances presented here, further investigation was not required, and counsel provided defendant with meaningful representation. Accordingly, the order of the Appellate Division should be affirmed. Order affirmed. Opinion by Judge Troutman. Chief Judge Wilson and Judges Garcia, Singas, Cannataro, and Holligan concur. Judge Rivera dissents in an opinion. Decided June 23, 2026.
Welcome to NYPT's Decisions on the Go, using AI for over a decade to help you listen to New York State Court of Appeals decisions on the go. After the podcast, visit www.nypt.com/law to read the full decision.